guys, welcome back to my channel. I have a review for you today, which is sort of a compare and contrast review because today I wanted to talk about The Martian. I will put a picture of the cover here since I do not have a physical copy of it. This book came out a while ago and I think probably people have kind of stopped talking about it by now, and so the reason I am doing this now is because when I initially heard the premise for this book / now it's a movie, I instantly had a just gut absolutely not, I will not read or watch that reaction to it. Because the premise just sounded horrific. You know, guy gets stranded on Mars and his crewmates leave him for dead. Like, no, absolutely not. But I did end up going to see it, and then I ended up reading it afterwards, and I did actually end up enjoying it, so I wanted to talk about why and how the movie in some ways worked better for me than the book, but the book also had a sort of different purpose. I will be talking about spoilers for this, so if you haven't seen or read it, I don't even think that really spoilers are that big of a deal for this particular situation because I knew the ending before I went into it, and for me it was less about the ending and more about experiencing the journey, so I don't think that spoilers are that big of a deal, but just so you know, this will have spoilers for it. So I was just completely ignoring this property until my roommates decided that they wanted to go see the movie. And I, by that point, had managed to figure out through just, you know, posts on Tumblr and stuff that Mark Watney lives and gets back to Earth and he's fine. And so knowing that was basically the only reason that I agreed to go watch this movie. Because if the story had been guy gets stranded on Mars, does everything he can to survive, and then dies, absolutely not. No way in hell would I be watching that movie. But since I knew that he survived, I was just like, okay, you can probably handle this. It's probably gonna be a really interesting movie experience. You should probably just go and see it. And so I felt that the movie, first of all, had stunning cinematography. I mean, obviously a lot of it was gonna be done with CGI. I think that possibly they used some sort of desert for a lot of the Mars shoots. I don't think it was all green screen, but I don't know that for sure. But either way, it was absolutely gorgeous cinematography. I also just like Matt Damon as an actor. I think that he's very charming, and I thought that Mark Watney in particular was extremely charming and very relatable very quickly, and I think that that was one of the reasons that the movie really worked for me, was that you had this instant emotional connection to this guy who is, you know, obviously stuck on Mars. It's a very perilous situation, and you very quickly care about him, and so therefore you care about his success and his survival. It also felt very emotionally immediate, like it was both, you know, terrifying and sometimes really funny, and I think that those worked really well. I think that the balance of those two was done really well because the pacing throughout the movie was very consistent. Like it had emotional high and lows, but it didn't ever spend too much time in the darkness and it didn't spend too much time in the humor, so it just had a really good balance and it, you know, worked with your emotions without, you know, going overboard in most cases. There were a couple points where I was just like, okay. For instance, one of the scenes that I thought was done really well that had a lot of emotional immediacy was the scene in which, so after the airlock blows, he has to, you know, put a tarp over the hole in the hab, and then there's a storm that night. And watching that scene where he's trying to count the potatoes that he has left while the storm is raging outside and the tarp keeps blowing back and forth, and how he's just trying so hard not to think about it because there's nothing he can do about it, but then at one point he just stops and just yells, and I felt like his terror and like desperate hope that this was gonna hold and that this was gonna work, because if it didn't work he was totally screwed. And you could really feel the terror in that moment. But then also there's the moment where he is in the rover and he starts playing, I think it was Hot Stuff, and he starts like dancing and singing along to it. Was hilarious! So it had a really good balance of those kinds of emotions, but all of them felt very immediate. I also thought that the logs in this worked really well, particularly because he was doing it in video form, so it basically basically felt like he was vlogging in space, which is so charming and so relatable that I just like instantly liked him. And so I think that actually the log entries in the movie worked better than the log entries in the book, which a large part of the book are these log entries that he's doing. And so I did the book on audiobook, which I think was a good choice because so much of it is, you know, his log entries that it felt sort of natural to have someone reading it out. But on the other hand, I do think that the logbooks in the book subtracted from the emotional immediacy because 95% of what we see of Mark Watney's time on Mars is filtered through the logbooks. And so for me, that sort of created a problem because a situation would arise and there would be some kind of problem and he'd be writing about the problem in this logbook and then he'll be like, okay, I think I have a solution. I'm gonna try X solution. Hopefully I don't die. And then basically just by virtue of there being another log entry, we know that he survived. Like, we might not know exactly how it worked and he might have had to like change the plan and that might be what he's talking about, but we know just by the fact that there's another log entry that he's still alive. And so I felt like it was sort of distancing in a way, that we didn't get that same kind of emotional immediacy. Also because he's writing down his own thoughts and emotions and he has his own kind of I'm a dude, I can't have emotion hang-ups. We don't get to see that same kind of like terror and relief that we did get to see in the movie. I also thought that the point of view shifts didn't always work because we go from the log entries, which are in first person, to then scenes on Earth, which are all in third person. And those didn't bother me so much, but then there were a couple sections that were scenes on Mars, but with a third person omniscient narrator. And I really didn't like those because as soon as we got to those, I was like, oh, something's about to go wrong. And that was the case. It was every time there was a third person omniscient narrator on Mars, it meant that something was about to go terribly wrong. And so I thought that that felt a little bit contrived. Also, for me personally, I didn't really care that much about the science part of the whole journey, which I think that the book and the movie had different objectives. I think that the book was more of a thought experiment. It was designed to be, you know, working out the science of how would this work, how would you survive on Mars. And I think that the movie was more focused on the human aspect of it. You know, how does that affect you emotionally? You know, all of those kinds of things. There was a lot of science in the movie, but I think that it had a different focus. And I generally care more about the human emotions than I do about the science side just because I'm not hugely into science. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And that's why I think that whether you prefer the book or the movie is going to determine largely on what you're there for. But so for me personally, I thought that his, you know, long extended explanations of oxygen and hydrogen reactions and all these kinds of like bacteria things, I just didn't really care about that much. And so I would do this, like I said, I was doing it on audiobook, so I was doing it mostly while driving in the car, which meant that I would just kind of tune out and focus on driving for 30 seconds while he goes on about oxygen and hydrogen reactions. Which is not to say that I didn't get emotional in the book. I did get emotional at a couple points. I got more emotional for the movie, I think, because I think that that was its job. And I did phrase it that way on purpose, because there were a couple moments where I felt like you could kind of see the work that they were doing in order for you to have this certain emotional response that you're having, and it only really bothered me in a couple points, like particularly at the end where we see the Ares 4 crew take off. Like the fact that somehow Johansson managed to have her baby like on the exact same day, and so there's the handy shot of Sebastian Stan's character like handing her the newborn while she's in the hospital bed. I was like, okay, sure. But again, it didn't really bother me, but I did sort of phrase it like that when I was talking about it to my friends and stuff. I said that it did its job, because that is kind of how I feel about it. I did get emotional about it, which was its job. But one thing that I also did really like about the movie was that aftermath, because the book ends basically as soon as Mark gets back to the big spaceship. Hermes, I think it was called, whatever. And so I thought that that was actually a tiny bit unsatisfying, because in the movie it's a very quick scene, but that moment where he's, you know, on the bench and you have the students, you know, jogging past, and then he sees the sprouted plant and he says, "Hey there," to the plant, the way that he said it to the potatoes. And then, you know, he goes into his lecture where he's talking about his experiences and, you know, passing on his knowledge, I thought that that was a really satisfying ending, and I thought that that had a lot of emotional truth to it. Like, that's probably what he would do, and you know, the way that he clearly hasn't totally moved on, but he has enough, you know, like he's back on Earth, he's doing well, but he just has these sort of little remnants of his time on Mars because he was there for so long that would leave a remnant. And so I thought that that was really rewarding to see in the movie, that we got to see a little bit of his recovery, if that makes sense. I also thought that the book, since it was doing it as a thought experiment, occasionally went a little bit too far in its thought experiments. For instance, in the book, there is that section where the Ares 3 crew is getting the resupply probe, and they're talking to their families, and Johansson tells her dad that if they don't get the supply probe, then she's going, the rest of the crew is going to commit suicide so that she can eat them, so that she will survive to get back to Earth. I was just like, I didn't want to know that, and I sort of got what he was doing in that moment, because what he was trying to do, I feel, is just say, here's what would happen if it failed. Like I said, I feel that this was sort of a thought experiment, and he was exploring every option. What would you do if that failed? And so the answer to that question is the crew would commit suicide except for Johansson, and she would be the one to survive. But to me, it just felt like unnecessary drama. Like it was almost instantly resolved because they get the probe in like the next 5 pages or something like that. And so it just felt like unnecessary worry, you know? And I even knew that they were gonna get the probe because I'd seen the movie already, but it just didn't feel like a thing that needed to happen at that point in the story. So you may have noticed that pretty much all of my critiques have been fairly nitpicky, which I will admit. I really liked the vast majority of both the movie and the book, and I definitely think that they're both worth checking out. I would say check out the movie in theaters because it is beautiful, except I think by the time I upload this, it will no longer be in theaters. Way to go me. But definitely check it out on as big a screen as you can manage. And if you're into audiobooks, I do recommend the audiobook for this one because I thought that the reading was done very well, and also I think because so much of it is in log format, it did make sense to have him reading it out. But that is it for my review of the book and the movie, The Martian by Andy Weir. Let me know if you've seen or read it down in the comments, and I will see you guys very soon with another video. Thanks for watching. Bye!